5, 4, 3.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for the IATA webinars. Today we will be looking at the topics of slots and the supply chain as part of the Industry Restart program. Before we commence with the proceedings today, just a reminder that please refrain from discussing any matters such as fares, charges, division or sharing of traffic, revenues, or other matters concerning competitively sensitive topics outside the scope of today's agenda. And due to that reasoning, we from the IATA side will not answer any questions pertaining to individual policies, commercial decisions, and or subjects that are part of bilateral commercial discussions between airline suppliers or customers. And before I hand over to Carlos Cedillo, our Director ATM Infrastructure, just a reminder, you can pose your questions into the Q&A at any time. And with that, Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Marcos. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today on our last webinar for this week. We have been talking about the industry restart. We went through the pilot and the airline readiness. We mentioned yesterday and discussed about the airport. And today we are looking to the slots and the supply chain. Next slide, please. So my apologies for those who have seen this before, but we are trying to be consistent in every single presentation. But it's important for us to put a context before we move to the presentation from our expert. So as you know, almost every challenge in aviation requires a team effort to solve it. Today we face the biggest challenge in commercial aviation history. We started an industry that largely has ceased to operate across borders while ensuring that it's not a meaningful vector for the spread of the COVID-19. Making this challenging means making significant changes across the whole arc of the air travel experience, meaning the pre-flight, the departure of airport, onboard, and also the post-flight. It will require government to assume broad new responsibilities in terms of assessing and identifying travel health risks, as the government did for security after the 9/11. Airline and airports will need to introduce and adapt process and procedures to minimize contagion risk in the airport and aircraft environment. Passengers will need to be empowered to take more control of the travel journey, including responsibility, assessing their own level of health risk before the journey. Next slide, please. Collaboration is vital. Government will need to work together to implement internationally consistent, mutually accepted measures that are essential to restoring air connectivity and passenger confidence in air travel. Governments and industry will need to work together, particularly to ensure that practicable development and implementation of those measures are in place. I'd like to highlight our commitment to the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, global provision for restoring air connectivity. These are contained in a takeoff guidance for air travel through the COVID-19 public health crisis, which offers an alternative and comprehensive framework of risk-based temporary measures for air transport operation. You see on our chat page a link to the IATA page where we can find all those information regarding the CART document, the takeoff document, and also all the guidance material that IATA has been developing in supporting this effort. Next slide, please. Successfully restarting air passenger travel while restoring confidence in the safety of air travel are vital prerequisite to enabling the global economy to recover from COVID-19. In normal times, as you see here describing in the slide, Aviation delivers 2.7 trillion in global GDP contribution. Every one of the 25 million employees in the airline industry helps to support up to 24 other jobs in the broader economy. More than a third of global trade by value moves by air. When this crisis ends, aviation needs to be ready for another role, helping to restore better economies and lift people's spirit to the power of travel. In this regard, we have put together a plan we call the airline industry restart. Next slide, please. You see here on a very notional description of the phases that we are looking to the recovery. We are today working on this immediate phase, having all these minimum measures in place. Thanks to ICAO again for putting together those global measures that are harmonizing the way they have been implemented globally. Moving forward on the intermediate phase, we are looking to those temporary arrangements to be more consistent, to have more, I would say, harmonized application, and make sure that there are mutual acceptance between the states, so you don't need to implement the same measures in every single place. And post-COVID-19, we are looking to those temporary arrangements to be removed, as we don't want to face the same as after 9/11, that we go to airports, we never know when we have to take our shoes, our belts. Every state has a different approach, and also we don't know why we are doing this. So we want to make sure that we manage in a way that this is going to be temporary. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, that's our plan. It's separated in two different areas. One is the system restart, that we have the system capability and make sure that we have all the planes back up in the sky. Driver experience, this is related to the biosafety. We have all the necessary measures and process to make sure and to avoid the spread of the COVID-19. And you have the demand restart side, where we are looking to restore confidence, so states are confident to relax travel restriction, we can come back to the sky, and the public is confident to get back into the planes as well. And we want to stimulate demand while keeping air travel affordable. Economies are a challenge today. We expect that people will be able to travel if it's affordable, and we want to get people back on the planes. So this week we're focusing on the system restart, the left part on your slide. And today is the last one on the system capability. You see our panel talking about different areas, and you see now from Felipe how complex the airport environment is and how important it is for us to be working together, all the stakeholders. Thank you again. Over to you, Felipe.
Felipe, you need to unmute, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning again. So Felipe Reis, I work for the IATA office here in Miami. My team and I, we take care of everything related to the airport operations in the region. And this covers the airport development part, financing of airports, cargo, passenger operations, security, facilitation. So again, everything which is around the airports. So as Carlos was saying, we'll be focusing on the system restart here, getting aircraft back to the skies. So Lillian, please. Okay, so why do we call restart? Because I guess as you can see from the slide, the declines have just been staggering. We've never seen anything like that before. So you'll surely have heard many of our CEOs say that this is far worse than 9/11, the global financial crisis, SARS, MERS, H1N1, and that's truly so. Basically, you just have to look at the numbers, and we're going to figure out quite quickly. So with that, what happened is that our business practically came to a standstill. So we have thousands of aircrafts grounded that can't fly. Operations are reduced to a bare minimum. In some countries, even there's zero operations. Not only that, but if you also look at what's happening going forward, we can see that the bookings for the year, comparing to 2019, are 82% down from what they used to be. So again, it's not very good news for the situation where we are. And if you look even more deeper into, for instance, long-haul flights, you'll see that, for instance, for the first week of November, which is about 20 weeks out, the bookings are about 60% below of the levels that they used to be at this time around, which will lead us to probably a very slow recovery and a very slow uptake in the passenger volumes going forward. Compounded to that, what we also see because of the situation around COVID and how people are behaving, their sentiment around traveling, we see that passengers are booking much later. So again, if you look at, for instance, for the month of May, 41% of the people that travel in May booked only 3 days before departure, which again puts a quite high pressure on in terms of airlines for planning, for scheduling, for operating their flights and trying to make sure that there is something in there for the airlines. Naturally, this is not only putting pressure on ourselves, the airlines, but also the entire value chain, and that includes, for instance, airports, air traffic control, ground services, fuel providers, and many other businesses that depend directly or indirectly on aviation. So the challenge we face is big, and that's what we have to be working on, trying to get out of the situation and slowly recover again. Lilian? So if you want to add to that, you'll see that our value chain, as Carlos was mentioning, is quite complex. So what you see here in the chart, and by the way, this chart was developed between Deloitte and ourselves. We are working with Deloitte on a study, so they put this chart together. So we are using it here to represent the complexity of the value chain. So if you look at the middle of the chart, you'll see the airport ecosystem and the main stakeholders that happen to be part of that, let's say, ecosystem, and everybody that's around it. So you'll see that in some cases you have 3, 4, 5 layers of different stakeholders beyond the airport themselves. So having to coordinate all of that, having to guarantee that all of that is in sync, that information is flowing, that people have the information they need, is not necessarily a very easy task. And given the situation again we are in, makes it even more complex because, as I will tell you in a few minutes, we have added level of complexity and insecurity, or uncertainty rather, that we have to deal in this complex situation. So part of the questions here again, as I was saying, is how do we get information down to the people? How do we do it at the right time? How do we do it in such a way that's coordinated, that we don't have information missing, that we get the right information to the right people in a coordinated fashion? Not necessarily a very easy task. And we, of course, want to assure that our customers that we will deliver to what the expectations are. And so we want the flights to go out on time, to be performed well. But again, it takes complexity, and our colleagues, my other colleagues, will then also share with you a few examples on what we are doing to make sure on different levels of the value chain that this is being done efficiently. So typically, when you look at how airlines schedule, we normally start with demand. But in the situation we are right now, demand is very uncertain. So I said passengers are booking much closer to the departure date, which does not allow airlines to really anticipate if the schedules that they're putting in are firm. And Lara will speak to that in much more detail. So it's very hard to plan that. And some of the challenges that come with this are, for instance, referring the evolution of the pandemic. So we don't know, for instance, China, you might have seen just this week, there's another rise in terms of COVID cases. Many airlines were forced to cancel flights. That generates unpredictability, which is never good for our business. We could then say, well, you could make use of models to anticipate that. But models, typically what they do, they work based on historical data. So compiling information in the middle of this, not having gone to anything like that ever in the history of aviation, is quite complex. So we are working also with a few other stakeholders, trying to predict how the development is going to be in terms of bookings, in terms of scheduling going forward, but it's highly uncertain for now. So what airlines do know today is that 2 to 4 weeks out, there's a pretty good level of certainty of what schedules will be looking like. But then if you go beyond that, if you go into 2, 3, 4 months, even more 6 months, the level of uncertainty is really very high. And because of the situation, or the compound of the situation, we anticipate that recovery is not going to be very linear. It will eventually accelerate or decelerate. As said, it will depend on how the pandemic evolves, and we'll have to adapt to this. Adding to this, another level of complexity is, as Carlos was referring, how countries will be implementing the roadmap that ICAO developed, the takeoff roadmap under the CART umbrella, the CART, which is the body that ICAO put together to manage the situation and to come out with their recommendations and the plans for the restart of the industry. So the implementation of those plans, we are working closely with governments, trying to guarantee that's done in a harmonized way. But on top of this, you should again consider that many borders are closed. They will reopen differently at different times, sometimes with different conditions, with different requirements. Some countries will have specific requirements, for instance, around cleaning, sanitation. There are requirements around crew, what they have or have not to do. Staffing that will probably have to be required and rehired. Given the situation, many of our stakeholders in the airlines themselves, they had to put people on furlough, or they had to reduce their payrolls. And if once business restarts, and we'll have to start bringing people back in again, it's probably one having to find the right people, bring them back in, but they don't need to be retrained, they need to be recertified. In many cases, they need to be vetted for security purposes. So that all takes time, which again, as I was referring, needs to be done in a coordinated fashion so that we have a stable operation environment. Lilian? Next slide, please, Lilian.
And over.
There we are. Oops, one too many. So while we work back here, this is my last slide. And what we are doing to get all of that aligned and hopefully well coordinated is we are engaging with our members and other industry stakeholders, trying to get their understandings around the complexities of the situation, trying to again address that chart that we had before on how we get the right information to the right people at the right time so that people can plan properly, and then with that guarantee operational environment which is stable, which is predictable, which will allow again ourselves to deliver what the customer's expectations are, including amongst each other, flights being on time. So the communication end is one, and the lead times, as I just said, is the other element that we are trying to assess together with our members and other stakeholders on what are the requirements in different locations, and they will vary, as I explained before, depending on the local circumstances. So it's a quite interesting, quite challenging job that we had ahead of us. But again, that's what we're known for, to keep on growing, to be very resilient, to come back, and we're sure we're going to get to this again. So thank you very much, and Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. And from the ground operation side, my name is Joseph Sweden. I'm the head ground operation in IATA. I am based in Montreal, and under the remit of ground operations are the AHM and IGOM, which you are familiar with, and also the IGHC, and we diversity into automation and digitalization. As Carlos mentioned, and with the shutdown process and the rapidly closing borders and strictly travel restrictions, our industry has been caught and prepared for dealing with such far-reaching effects from the pandemic. It was indeed apparent that our industry was in need of a consistent and coherent take on how to deal with the problem of COVID-19. The ground operations team at IATA has been working with various industry stakeholders and other IATA colleagues to compile a set of practical guidelines to assist the ground operation community. We were one of the first with guidance materials in response to calls from our stakeholders on how to deal with this patchwork of hastily assembled and often contradictory rules. Later on, the emphasis of queries shifted to how to deal with parked aircraft, storage of ground support equipment, currency of certification, training, use of passengers' aircraft for cargo, and more. Resulting from this, we have developed the guidance for ground handling during COVID-19. We were keen at least to start working on how our industry was going to restart, and we had a lot of support and input for our first guidance for ground handling return to service document. As a companion to this return to service document, we have also developed the guidance for aircraft cleaning and disinfection during post-pandemic. These guidelines are live documents. They have been already revised, allowing us to add more specifics as a reaction to feedbacks received from the industry. As you can see on the second slide, please, Lillian. As you can see on the slide, the first bullet point on guidance for ground handling during COVID-19. This document was the first of the guidance material that we have developed. It took a couple of weeks to get together all the information and the people to consolidate the contents into a coherent document that addressed the pressing need for guidance at a time when the situation was changing rapidly. Our stakeholders understood there were likely to be several updates as everyone learned from the experience and shared their successes and failures. The document was developed as a very general document, giving mostly high-level information on ground handling considerations as they were understood at the time, and it is now on its 5th edition. What this document covers is general information about COVID-19, ground handling recommendations, including passenger check-in, transfer and gate handling, baggage and cargo handling, ramp handling, including aircraft ground movement and parking, a ULD handling, unit load device handling, aircraft cleaning, catering handling, ground support equipment storage, including planning, what to do during storage, and considerations regarding return to service. Training, including recurrent training, currency extensions, absence from work. The second bullet demonstrates the guidance for ground handling return to service. As the industry got past the initial rapidly changing phase of shutdown and the reality of an indefinite period of very limited activity, the concern shifted to how to restart the industry in an orderly fashion. Everyone has experienced the often chaotic situation during shutdown and had no desire to go through the same unplanned and disorganized process while starting up again. It's clear that a restart is a huge task which requires a level of cooperation between competitive business interests on an unprecedented scale. With our stakeholders, the overriding concern was global consistency supported by use of global standards and procedures such as IGOM and AHM to enable proper planning for a smooth ramp to begin the ground operation. Faced with the enormity of the scope of the work to be done to restart the industry, we focus on the aspect that we and our technical reference groups are expert to produce the guidance for ground handling return to service. The document is done on a checklist format for ease of use and is designated to easily slot into other documentation delivered by other IATA specialist groups that form part of the overall IATA Restart portfolio. What this document covers: the utilization of common industry standards, return to service, including pandemic management, risk management, operational procedures review, airport readiness, regulatory framework, collaboration, and airport readiness checklist, personnel readiness that includes personnel readiness checklist, health and sanitary measures that includes a multi-layered approach concept, occupational health and safety, human factor, security readiness that includes airport security, screening staff. All these are embedded in this document with operational readiness that includes operational readiness and GSE, ground support equipment readiness checklist. This assessment that includes sample templates of most common hazard, risk, and mitigation action. The third one on the slide is the guidance for aircraft cleaning and disinfection during and post-pandemic. While our first guidance document contained an initial attempt to address the need for guidelines on how to deal with COVID and passenger and aircraft in which COVID might have been present, this document goes into the topic in detail. It is compiled with the help of our medical advisor and the medical advisory group, as well as our experts in areas such as cabin safety, passenger handling, and the effect of cleaning materials on aircraft interior surfaces, all of whom have contributed their experiences learned through the shutdown period. As such, it comprises the latest available information on this critical topic. What this document covers again is definition and terminology, regulatory and industry references, pandemic cleaning and disinfection programs, cleaning and disinfection products, aircraft cleaning and disinfection on the ground, cleaning and disinfection during an event, waste management during pandemic, aircraft cargo compartment cleaning, and also last, potential disinfection methods. There are a multitude of new products, procedures that claim to be able to be effective against COVID. The effectiveness of these have not necessarily been proven, nor has there been time to properly assess the possible damaging effect of some of these products have on certain surface used in aircraft. Of course, there were other measures to which the ground operations team has contributed to. Is the guidance for transport of cargo in passenger cabin. Passenger aircraft are not certified to carry cargo on passenger seats, or cargo unit load devices such as pallet and containers in the passenger cabin secured on seat tracks. Any reconfiguration of an aircraft in this manner requires full evaluation of cargo restraints that requires a formal authorization from National Aviation Authority of the state of the operator and a comprehensive risk assessment that shall be performed by the operator. All what you have seen, those guidance materials, as Carlos mentioned before, they are in the CART, which is the Civil Aviation Recovery Task Force at ICAO. And that we have developed need to be evaluated. All those guidance material need to be evaluated by the airline and ground handlers. As such, of them have their own take on the post-COVID guidance, as each airline, ground handlers, and airport has variation depending on the scope of work in relation to ground operations turnaround. My colleagues has mentioned the difficulties in pinning down the ground time. So our industry is still not sure in what context they will apply these guidelines in relation to the new ground operation turnaround time, which will affect the required minimum connecting time, and this will not be ready, not before mid-July. Here are some topics that I would like to bring to your attention that can be benefit from. Is our IATA training department is presently preparing the e-learning model for GSE returning to service and should be ready during July. There are more webinars in the pipeline, and I would like you to consult our website. And we would like, on behalf of the ground operation team, to thank you. And I will pass on to Lara from our team. Thank you. Lilian?
Thanks, Joseph. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lara Morn and I work in IATA's offices in Geneva, and we're leading the airport slots work for IATA, but also at the moment covering this activity around schedule planning and how we're getting those industry standards in place to ensure that everybody's receiving the information that Felipe's already mentioned is so critical to this restart phase. So just before I head into exactly what we're doing under this activity, what is a slot and what is a schedule often comes to mind. What we're talking about in terms of slots here is indeed the airport slots that relate to the schedule and are the slots that are allocated for the world's most congested airports. So where there is so much demand that the capacity can't quite meet the schedules that are planned, we have slot allocation in place and slot coordination. And those are the slots that we're talking about today, just to ensure that there's no confusion with the ATC world. So we're ensuring that we can encompass this area of very important planning that the airlines are undertaking at the moment in terms of the restart, but also making sure that what's happened over the last couple of months can be looked on as a way of moving forward as well. The schedule really does encompass everything that the airline is now planning to do and how they predict and plan their restart, but it also underpins everything the industry is looking to do as part of the restart. When people are planning to operate, to which markets, which regions, and in what capacity are the aircraft changing, is the fleet changes that are instrumental in terms of the airport capacity usage, and indeed the load factors that they're predicting to come onto those schedules are also important to this area of the activity. And so one thing, if we can go on to the next slide, sorry. The first thing that we all need to be obviously critically aware of, and that Felipe's already spoken about, is just how disastrous the last couple of months have been for the airlines and indeed the whole aviation sector. The airline schedule within a matter of days had to basically be broken down into something that was nothing the airlines had ever done before, essentially cancelling every single flight that they had moving forward for the next few days and weeks. And in terms of the drama that unfolded, it was very sudden and dramatic, and this sustainability of cancelling flights one after the other really was in place for the last 2 months. It's taken a lot of effort on the airline side, and I think at times the whole industry has struggled to understand exactly what information to use in order to plan their own resources and ability to work within the situation. Quite simply, it was everybody was all hands on deck, whether it be network planning, scheduling, the ops teams and the fleet management, to really understand what kind of schedule could be left in place, if any. Border restrictions were coming in quick and fast and in a very uncoordinated manner. And so it really was a difficult task and challenge to really understand the gravity at the beginning of the crisis. And then as this has gone on through the last few months, it's become clear, obviously, that the role of schedule and network and indeed slots management was that of cancellation rather than actually planning the ability to operate. So now that we're getting past this very critical phase that we've all been through, it's really how does the industry work going forward? Things have changed overnight in terms of planning. All of the tools that we use to predict demand are not really reliable anymore. The airlines are having to plan very close to the operation, and so schedule planning in terms of short term now means literally a couple of days, maybe a week ahead. Medium term has started to mean something more like a month or two ahead. When we talk about a strategic plan, I think we're just talking really to the end of this current northern summer season now, rather than where the airlines usually would be, which is looking at their winter schedule and next summer's schedule, and indeed making sure all of those flights are on sale. I think most airlines now would feel the summer has been put to bed and is an operating schedule. But as we all know, actually the airlines are now day to day looking at the demand that's present and planning their summer schedule still, and hoping that they can reinstate flights and allow some of that demand that is there to operate. So really, to enable everybody to do this, flexibility has to be the key here. The airlines are having to be very agile, nimble, to be able to react to borders reopening. There is some coordination and there is some head and lead time in terms of understanding which borders are reopening, But also there are still restrictions in place that are extended at very short notice. We've heard what's happened in Beijing in the last few days. So things do change still very quickly. So unfortunately, I think as an industry, we all still have to be very flexible and responsible in terms of how we share that information. But we also have to be prepared that there are going to be cancellations still taking place as the schedules are rebuilt, because really the airlines now are really testing what demand's there. And as Felipe said, the critical factor to all of this in terms of the lead time is what demand and what the consumer behaviour looks like. So we're seeing this very close into the actual flight, with 40% upwards booking within 3 days of the operation. And it's incredibly difficult for the airlines to give really a huge lead time to all of their industry partners with any certainty as to what they will operate. But rest assured, they are trying to operate everything they can to ensure that the operation does now recover. Could you just go on to the next slide, please? We talk about this 2-week window at the moment, and indeed I think it is still there. But as some of the borders are reopening, we're seeing that lead time increase to sort of 4 weeks. And in some markets where there's been, like the European Union, a more coordinated effort to reopen the borders in the last week, perhaps more of a 2-month window even now of certainty. But even within that window, there's still a grave lack of ability to actually say with certainty individual flights will operate. It's just clear now what the airlines would like to operate in terms of the schedule they have in place. So one of the key things that we envisage needing to be managed as we go forward is this key aspect of what available airport capacity there is and how it's allocated. So even at the world's most congested airports, I think a lot of people think, well, why do you need slots now? Surely there isn't enough demand to require airport slots. Actually, what we're seeing is the temporary reductions in demand, in capacity available, driven by the security and health measures that are being put in place. And indeed, the ability for airlines to actually match the demand means there's probably still a lot of operations, mainly in the peaks. And so there are still constraints that need to be managed. Even if it's not in the terminal due to these measures, aircraft are going to have longer times on the ground, most likely, particularly as the load factors increase. We're going to see longer turnaround times because of these measures. Minimum connection times are going to change because of the biosecurity in place. And so the airport structure and the ability to allocate that capacity needs to be closely monitored as well. So what we're looking for is obviously complete slot flexibility as we move forward through the recovery phase to match what the airlines need to do with their schedule as well. And the ability to really build back global connectivity relies on the airlines being able to put in place at least a skeleton schedule to connect all of these airports again as they once did. But in order to do that, we really need to protect the actual integrity of what was there pre-crisis. And for that, one of the activities we're doing in this area is to advocate for a slot waiver that continues into the winter season from what we've had this summer. Could you just go on to the next slide? Thanks. And talking about slot coordination, I think, is really very relevant when we talk about standards. So slot coordination doesn't just go away because of the crisis and the recovery, and actually becomes very important as part of the ability to restart and rebuild those schedules, because it is the basis and the backbone to what the airlines knew pre-crisis. So the slot coordination process remains relevant and certainly is applicable through the whole of the restart, and we're ensuring with the coordinator community that they can still work effectively between the airports and the airlines to receive the information about the schedules, allocate the slots and relay that information to the supply chain. But there's also a lot of airports that are not slot coordinated. So we're relying on the schedule standards that we have in place today to ensure that the supply chain is informed of the schedules and the changes and any cancellations that take place. And what we really want to make sure here is that those established standards can be relied on, even in such a dynamic and agile environment that we're seeing now. I suppose I can't stress enough how different it is to what we saw pre-crisis. And those standards really now need to get up to speed to ensure that they can support what's needed over the next 18 months. So I think that brings me to the end of the slots and schedules, and I'll hand over to Ruby.
Hello, and thank you, Lara. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Ruby Syed, and I am the head of ATM advocacy working in the Safety and Flight Operations Division in Montreal within the IATA team. I work primarily with air traffic management policies, positions, and how we can improve and drive the system. So that is a good intro to what I would like to share with you today. And when we move to the next slide, you can see a little bit of a simplified ecosystem than what Felipe showed, but it captures the same theme that when we talk about any component within the aviation supply chain, we're talking about a complexity of systems, people, and processes all working together to ensure that we have a safe and efficient flight operations throughout the different phases. Specifically for air traffic management, there are various components that come into play to ensure that we have safe separation of aircraft and that we have efficient operations. So in looking to the restart and the recovery of air navigation service provisions, whether it's during the immediate or intermediate stages that Carlos mentioned, or even post-COVID-19, we need to take into consideration not just the specific elements related to air traffic management, but also the interfaces with the other components in the supply chain. And as we move into the second slide, or the next slide, please, I would like to share with you why not just why we are calling it restart. As Felipe mentioned, air travel almost came to a standstill, specifically in April, which is unprecedented. We have not seen this before. At the same time, the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic is also changing the operating environment. We are not just restarting, but we are coming back to very different assumptions in how we manage and handle flight operations. So in that context, when we think about the restart activities moving forward, we're also considering what elements of the system need to adapt to the new normal. As mentioned by my colleagues before, there are different factors playing into this changing operating environment, whether it's the unpredictability or uncertainty with regards to changing traffic levels in the different regions, motivated by different flying public behavior, or whether we have new requirements for opening borders or additional health safety requirements, all of which will affect airline scheduling, and that has an impact on how you plan and coordinate the availability of capacity at an airport and at an airspace ATM or air navigation service level. So with that, we are looking, for example, Lara mentioned flexibility, and as we look at the different parameters and factors moving forward and the changes we are seeing because of the pandemic, we need flexibility in various areas. A lot of the processes and procedures that were taking longer periods, such as granting of flight permissions, will need to be rethought. We need more flexibility, especially because airline scheduling, as Lara just mentioned, is going to be different than what we are used to. The pandemic also continues to have a huge impact on workforce and the working environment. Felipe mentioned it a little bit during his presentation. And that is impacting air navigation service providers, whether it's due to positive cases or requirements for physical distancing, or even within this period if we have retirement of senior and experienced staff. So the need to change working schedules and rostering of air traffic controllers has an impact on the capacity. And one of the questions we are trying to address is how fast can we call back air traffic controllers and staff in general across the supply chain as schedules change. And this leads into the discussion about the lead time, the communication, the coordination, because without collaboration, we won't be able to do that. Another impact on workforce and work environment is related to training and licensing. Physical distancing is affecting training, especially OJT. While it's not hindering it, it's forcing us to adapt to this new normal in terms of staff training. And it might be expediting certain tools or expediting the use of certain tools, for example, virtual training. How can we improve the quality of virtual training and so on? It is also expected that we might face some challenges related to critical infrastructure that is required to navigate aircraft or to support aircraft navigation. It was mentioned before the impact of parked aircraft in some airports, which would have an impact on airport as well as airspace capacity. We are also considering and looking at the different safety hazards that need to be considered within this new operating environment, and to make sure that we are taking note of all the elements that we need to address and mitigate. Examples include how do we ensure that we mitigate human factors related event associated with results or impacts of COVID-19, for example, increased stress levels, increased workload level or changing workload levels because of the different scheduling of people and rostering of traffic controllers. Another possible or potential risk that we are looking at is, do the airports with low traffic levels over a period of time face a risk of increased wildlife? So these are things that need to be considered within this changing operational environment that we are seeing as we restart and as we support resumption of operation. And that leads to the next slide, where we highlight, or on which we highlight, how IATA is working to address these challenges related to the recovery and restart of air navigation services. As a first element, we are looking at the safety risks and hazards. We are in collaboration with our partners, and within that, we are conducting an industry safety risk assessment, taking into considerations or hazards related to human factors for air traffic controllers, availability and serviceability of critical infrastructure, how to maintain competency and training during COVID-19, how do we maintain safety culture and safety reporting during a pandemic with all the elements that it's bringing to the working environment. Within this safety risk assessment, we are identifying the hazards and developing the mitigation measures, all of which feed into educational webinars that we are organizing in collaboration with our partners as well. And the aim of the webinars is to increase the awareness about these potential hazards. At the same time, it's also a platform to engage experts across different disciplines and different regions. And this will all enrich the safety bulletins that we are working on, focusing on each hazard element or type of event. At the same time, we are working on making available online tools and dashboards to increase situational awareness for our members. In addition, when we talk about restart and we talk about communication, which was highlighted by Felipe and Laura, it's important, as Felipe said, to have the right information available for the right people. And that includes making sure that airlines are able to have timely and accurate information that is required for them to take operational decisions. And we are working with our partners as well as with ICAO to ensure that we have certain mechanisms and recommendations in place for information sharing and for collaboration. Looking at the aspect of capacity and how we can ensure that we have available capacity to meet traffic demand, especially in the changing environment, we are working on this with our partners in order to promote best practices such as collaborative decision making or traffic flow management. In addition, part of this feeds into the work that Felipe mentioned in terms of establishing communication protocols and agreeing on what would be an acceptable lead time model for everybody to have all the information they need in order to plan their schedules, to plan their staffing levels, to have the available capacity to support traffic in a changing environment. And in conclusion, we are also working with our partners to complement all of those activities to develop guidance material and best practices that include recommendations and considerations for the operational aspect of restart in terms of the system capabilities, specifically air navigation service provision and air traffic management. And we are making all those guidance material available, of course, on our webpage. And with that, I want to thank you for joining this webinar, and happy to take any questions right now. So I'll hand over back to my colleagues. Thank you.
Ruby, thank you very much. And with that, we will head directly into the Q&A, very conscious of time. So I'll call out the colleague in advance who I think can provide the best response to the question. So this is the one that has the most likes up to now. So Felipe, I think, and Joseph, this one's for you. Can you please elaborate on the capacity-related implications of introducing physical distancing within terminals?
Sure. Thanks, Marcos. IATA, here at IATA, we manage a handbook, quite comprehensive handbook, which is called the Airport Development Reference Manual, which we developed together and published together with ACI, our sister association on the airport side, and lots of different consultants in different areas of the business. This manual is a kind of the reference for the development of manuals, which is a kind of obvious, but it determines what are the requirements for planning purposes for space at airports. So what our colleagues in the airport development area did, they went back to the manual and they started to emulate what would be the capacity of airports using social distancing, as you just said, Marcos. And we run basically 3 scenarios. One is the existing scenario, and then we added a scenario with 1.5 meter separation and then 2 meter separation between people. And the conclusion we reached is that if we are to use, for instance, the 2 meter separation as the basis for the analysis, we are basically halving the capacity of the terminal. So we are reducing it by 50%. So it's quite dramatic in terms of the capacity to process. So that's one element that both Lara and Ruby mentioned on the sites. But that's one of the concerns we surely will have over time. So again, we are at a stage where traffic is resuming. The loads are still kind of okay. But once we add more flights and the loads hopefully start to pick up, that will be potentially something that we'll have to work out together with the remaining stakeholders of the industry to make sure that we don't, let me say, artificially reduce the capacity of the entire system because of the measures that are currently required because of the COVID situation.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. Joseph, anything you want to add to that? Joseph, you're on mute, I think.
Felipe covered it all. Nothing to add from my side unless other specific question could arise.
So I will go through the question list, trying to see who is the ones that have the most likes. So I think this is a pretty general one, so I'll read it out and let's see who we find as a taker. But I think it's more or less Felipe and Joseph again, maybe Carlos. Has IATA defined protocols for airlines to safely operate after borders are reopened? Surely there must be a standardization of practice and guidelines implemented to somehow win travelers' confidence in travel. Would IATA introduce a COVID compliance sign for all airlines that comply and warn against those airlines who do not? It is important to reinstate confidence back into our travelers and create the demand again. So, I don't know, Carlos, you want to do a general?
I can take that one. Thank you. To the guidance, yes. If you look at what we have today developed on the different areas in support to the CART, it's important to highlight that what we are trying to do is to foster global harmonization. So we are relying on that document that was developed by ICAO with support of all the organizations, and we participate on that one. As Felipe mentioned, ACI, our sister organization on the airport, Council, the one responsible for the air traffic side, and also WHO. We have several different UN organizations also participate on this document. So it's a very comprehensive guidance that touch different areas. And we as IATA, we develop specific ones for cruise, for cargo, for ground handling, as Joseph mentioned. So it's at this point is very comprehensive. And regarding to the other questions, yes, we are considering this possibility. We have a larger experience with audit programs. We have our IOSA, IATA Operation Safe Audit, that we audit operations on the airlines, and we have most of the international carriers, not only IATA members, beyond IATA members, being part of this audit program. So in terms of experience and quality control, we are very well positioned to go in that direction. We are still discussing how this is going to look like, but it's likely that we are going to go to the direction to have an audit program to help support the restart. I hope this helped answer the question.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Anyone else in the group wishing to add to that? Okay, with that, we'll move to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Joseph here. Also, the industry would like to have a harmonized and standardized set of procedures and processes that we should look for simplicity and not complexity below the wing, and how are we going to encourage the restart on a proper way.
Okay, that kind of covers the answer to one of the questions out there, so that was good. So this one is about mainly recertifying employees and staff. Is there a way to coordinate and standardize the security and recertification checks required to bring staff back that can like fast track the process, especially for those who have been furloughed and now need to return to work? So I don't know if it's maybe Carlos and maybe Ruby.
So I think the security, Felipe, if you want to start with the security part.
Felipe, yeah.
The security is an interesting one because it really depends on the country. So every country is different, which is a kind of obvious. But if you go, for instance, to some European countries where employees are furloughed, so they are still technically on the airline or whoever stakeholder payroll, they can be easily brought back into operation. Sometimes they might need to go through a quick training just to make sure that they're up to it, but it should be easy. In other countries, though, when people get fired, get removed out of the payrolls, and they need to be rehired, there's an extensive process behind it. So it could be as short as 1 day, but it could be as long as many weeks. So it's really dependent on the country. Unfortunately, there's not one cut that covers the whole world.
If I can complement from the crew perspective, the maintenance side, we have been working with states and ICAO to get the license extended, and also this has been very successful in terms of getting states also recognizing other states' measures. There is also in the website you find a place where you can see all the states, all the measures they have been taking. We have more than 170 states that have already registered their measures they are taking in terms of crew, not only the license part, but also the medical part. And Ruby, can you expand a little more on the air traffic control side? Because we have been working with Council on this area, especially on the human factor side.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. And indeed, for the air traffic controller side, There has been also an extension that was approved by the different governments. But we are looking at also not the human factors within the team when you are losing some of the staff related to retirement. So that has an impact on the team, on the experience, the level of expertise, the level of confidence, especially if you are losing your mentor or your coach. At the same time, we are looking at how do we maintain competency and training, not just during COVID, but beyond, because physical distancing is going to continue to be a requirement in the short to medium term. So how do we ensure that we effectively conduct the training, revalidation over the shoulder, OJT, all of that with the restrictions of physical distancing, and in some cases, how does that hinder using the mask? We recently had a conversation with someone from an air navigation service provider, and he was doing a check for a traffic controller coming back, and he shared that it was difficult managing that kind of training and check with all these restrictions. So this is part of not only looking at the challenge, but how do we adapt to this new normal in terms of working environment and training? And we see that there's now a lot of investment in new approaches to conducting this training and ensuring the availability of staff, especially that it will have an impact on capacity and ability to sustain traffic as schedules start picking up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ruby. So being very conscious of time and that we're just slightly over the hour, I will go to the last two questions. We will get back to everyone. You will directly and also through the website. So there is a question on costs, and I think we can take this one because IATA has a sort of stance on additional costs coming through due to the current measures that have to be implemented. So I guess this is for the entire group, but I guess mainly Carlos. Can you elaborate on the additional or increased cost resulting from the various measures aimed at ensuring COVID-19 health measures? How will the costs be taken into account into defining the standards?
Yeah. Thank you, Marcus. In fact, the first element we took in consideration on defining the measures was really the safety of the passengers and the crews and everyone involved on the operations. And of course, there will be a cost with those measures. Most of the measures are related to health. So there is an expectation that those costs will be taken by states. They are imposing those measures, not by the airlines or by the customers. And as I mentioned in the beginning, those measures are supposed to be transition, not permanent, only during the period that they are required. And as long as we move having a test that proven to be reliable, fast, and can be globally introduced, something that we don't have today. Some of the measures can start being removed, and also as we go along developing medicines and a vaccine, those measures should be taken from the system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. So unless anyone in the group still wants to add something on costs, then I would say we move to the last question, and this is a general question, a nice one to finish off the webinar. How has the collaboration between IATA and the governments been? So I think this also goes back to the ICAO and the CART process.
Yes, I can take that one as well. In fact, crises, they always bring opportunities, and this one is one that having shown that the level of collaboration between industry and governments has been excellent. The development of those guidance principles from ICAO on the CART has been done in a very, I would say, fast measure. normally, for those that are not familiar with, the development of a standard in ICAO can take from 2 to 5 years to be developed. We as an industry and the states together, we were able to develop those measures in less than a month. So it shows the level of collaboration, and we are really looking to the governments to continue with the level of collaboration, supporting the airline to restart.
Okay, and I thought we could sign off, but I just received a question on slots. So Laura, you still have time for one question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and so it basically relates to the grounding of the A380, and if we see if this will have any effect on slot availability or slot allocations at the airports. I guess also having to do with the fact that the 380 normally requires a lot more spacing, especially after takeoff or after landing.
Yeah, so I think there will be a big change over the coming years to the kind of profile, if you like, and the makeup at the airports of the schedules, the networks, and the fleet operating there. But I think what's important to take into account here is that the slots are not just runway based often, but now more than ever are going to be slots allocated, taking into account the runway capacity and the terminal capacity and the gate assignments as well. So where A380s may leave the airport, particularly at the large hub airports where perhaps they had whole facilities catering to the A380s, I think those stands are still appropriate for the next size of aircraft, and given that the capacities are going to be under some constraints within the terminal in terms of processing passengers with the new social distancing measures and the other measures in place, onboarding and disembarking the aircraft is going to take some more time. So all of those facilities that were set up for such a large aircraft will become very relevant for a slightly smaller aircraft filling their space. So I think what we will see is obviously a lot of movement in terms of the fleet deployed onto the schedules today and the slots today, but I can't imagine that a lot of those slots are going to go wasted. So the airlines will redeploy the schedule onto the existing slots because slots are not route specific or aircraft specific. And where any slots do become available over the coming seasons, they'll go back into the pool to be reallocated.
Okay, thank you. And so I think we covered all the expertise on the call today. I know there's many questions regarding airline refunds in the queue. For those, we would kindly ask you to speak to the individual airlines, as this is a pure commercial decision by each airline on how to treat refund cancellations and vouchers. And with that, I'd like to thank all the participants. I'd like to thank all the people who followed our webinar today. As we said before, all the information will be available on the website. And with that, for those of you listening in on the eastern part of the world, good evening. Those who still have an afternoon coffee in Europe to go, good afternoon. And those in the Western Hemisphere and the Americas just waking up, have a good rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.